we first met, before we did the pilot, I said she was 12 years younger than I. She had never done comedy. She, within no time at all, became as good a comedian as I've ever worked with. She was just sensational.
He just turned 100 years old, and there's still one name that comes up in almost every interview he gives: Mary Tyler Moore. Not a co-star he mentions out of habit. Not a name a publicist scripted into an answer. A woman he has quietly, consistently, and honestly talked about for over 60 years. Long before anyone called it a story worth chasing. So what has Dick Van Dyke actually said about her? Why does he keep saying it now that he's 100? And what really happened between two people who spent 5 years pretending to be married on national television? Here's the real story, without the exaggeration. Start at the beginning, because the beginning explains everything that came after. In 1961, a 20-something dancer with almost no television credits walked into an audition room to read for the role of a comedy writer's wife on a new CBS sitcom. The writer was going to be played by a tall, loose-limbed physical comedian who'd spent years bouncing between Broadway and local television without quite breaking through. Neither of them was famous yet. Neither of them had any idea that the show they were about to make would still be studied, rerun, and talked about more than 6 decades later. That show was The Dick Van Dyke Show, and it ran from 1961 to 1966, and it turned both of its lead actors into two of the most recognizable faces in American television almost overnight. What made the show work wasn't just the writing, although the writing was sharp and the physical comedy was some of the best of its era. What made it work was the two people at the center of it. Van Dyke played Rob Petrie, a New York comedy writer who was neurotic in exactly the right doses. Anxious enough to be funny, grounded enough to be likable. Moore played Laura Petrie, his wife, and she brought something to that role that television hadn't really seen before. A young wife who was witty, stylish, a little sarcastic, and never just a punchline machine standing next to the male lead. Together, they didn't just perform a marriage. They made audiences believe in one. People didn't tune in just to laugh. They tuned in because Rob and Laura Petrie felt like a couple they might actually know. People who teased each other without cruelty, who argued and made up in the space of one scene, who could finish each other's sentences without it ever feeling written. That kind of chemistry is rare, and it doesn't usually happen by accident. Anyone who has spent real time on a set will tell you that pretending to be married to someone 5 days a week for years tends to blur lines that were never supposed to blur in the first place. You start laughing at things off camera that you're only supposed to laugh at on camera. You develop a private rhythm, a shorthand, the kind of thing outsiders can sense but never quite name. For Van Dyke and Moore, something clearly clicked beyond the scripted scenes, and he has never pretended otherwise. He has talked about it in interviews stretching back decades, and he's talked about it again recently, in the run of interviews tied to his 100th birthday. This was never a secret he was hiding and finally decided to release. It's a story he has told, in pieces, for most of his adult life. Here's the part people love to bring up, and it's worth telling honestly instead of dressing it up as more than it was. Van Dyke has openly acknowledged that he developed real feelings for Moore while they were making the show together. Not a secret relationship. Not an affair. A genuine, old-fashioned crush. The kind you'd expect from someone half his age at the time, except this one belonged to a grown man starring opposite a colleague he was supposed to be treating as exactly that, a colleague. By his own account, the two of them would get fits of laughter around each other on set, to the point where it became something the crew had to work around. Takes got blown, not because either of them was unprofessional, but because they simply couldn't hold a straight face standing that close to each other. If you've ever worked next to someone you liked a little too much, you already understand that specific kind of laughter. It's not really about the joke. It's about the person standing next to you. There's a detail Van Dyke has mentioned more than once over the years that tends to stick with people, and it's the psychiatrist story. At some point, he says, a psychiatrist essentially told him what should have been obvious to everyone around him, that he had a crush on his co-star. Sometimes it takes an outsider to say the quiet part out loud, because the two people in the middle of a situation like that are usually the last ones to name it. It's a small, almost funny anecdote on its own, but it tells you how real those feelings actually were. This wasn't something manufactured decades later for a headline. It was a genuine complicated pull between two people who spent years performing a marriage, 5 days a week, in front of a live studio audience, with cameras rolling and a crew watching every single take. Now here's the detail that changes how you should read this entire story, and it's the part that gets skipped over whenever this gets turned into a clickbait headline. Both Van Dyke and Moore were married to other people for most of the years they spent playing husband and wife on television. That's not a footnote. That's the actual center of the story. Whatever existed between them, and by his own repeated admission, something clearly did, it never became an affair. There's no credible account, from either of them, of a secret relationship happening behind the scenes. What existed was mutual affection, obvious chemistry, and two people who chose, consistently, not to act on it, because they had already made commitments to other people and they took those commitments seriously. It's worth sitting with how unusual that restraint actually was, given the setting. These two spent years in close physical proximity, essentially being paid to perform intimacy, week after week, in front of writers, directors, a studio audience, and eventually millions of viewers at home. Plenty of real relationships have started under far less pressure than that. The fact that this one didn't cross that particular line isn't a boring detail to skip past on the way to a scandal. It's the reason this story has held up for 60 years instead of turning into a messy chapter neither of them wanted to revisit. It also says something about how seriously both actors took their work and their marriages. They understood that on-screen chemistry didn't have to spill into real life to be meaningful, and in a strange way, drawing that line probably made the performance stronger, because both of them could commit fully to the fiction without either of them worrying about where the fiction ended. And Van Dyke wasn't the only one who talked about this over the years. Mary Tyler Moore spoke about their connection too, in her own interviews, well before she passed away in 2017. She described the chemistry between them in terms that lined up with his account almost exactly. It felt real to her as well, and she confirmed, just as directly as he did, that it never became a physical relationship. When two people on opposite sides of a rumored romance give matching accounts across separate interviews, separated by years, with no coordination between them, that consistency is about as close to a verified account as celebrity history usually offers. The attraction, by every credible source available, was mutual. It wasn't exaggerated later to sell a book or promote a project. It was two co-stars who developed real feelings for each other while playing pretend for a national audience, and who both handled it the same honest way, without ever crossing into something that would have hurt the people they'd actually married. So if there was never an affair, never a scandal, never anything actually hidden here, why does this story keep resurfacing, decade after decade, like it's brand new information nobody has ever heard? Maybe because what happened between them was never really about romance at all. Maybe it was about something that outlasted romance entirely, and that's really the heart of what makes this story worth telling. For millions of viewers, Rob and Laura Petrie didn't just look like a married couple. They felt like one, and that feeling is exactly why people have spent decades assuming there had to be something more going on once the cameras stopped rolling. Their timing on screen was effortless. They anticipated each other's reactions before a line was even finished, and neither of them ever looked like they were trying too hard, which is an incredibly difficult thing to fake convincingly, even for two very talented performers. Van Dyke has often praised Moore's instincts, saying she always knew exactly how to lift a scene without pulling focus from anyone else in it. She could match his physical comedy beat for beat and then turn around and ground the same scene with real warmth. He, in turn, gave her room to experiment and to lead. They weren't competing for laughs. They were building them together, and audiences could feel that difference every single week the show aired. Looking back, it's easy to understand why people confuse that kind of chemistry with a secret romance. But some of the strongest on-screen partnerships in television history were never built on hidden relationships at all. They were built on mutual respect, shared instincts, and years spent learning exactly how the other person thinks and moves and reacts. That's what Rob and Laura Petrie became for an entire generation of television viewers, not because of a hidden scandal, but because two genuinely gifted performers trusted each other completely, on and off camera. That trust didn't evaporate the moment the series ended in 1966. If anything, it became the foundation for a friendship that lasted the rest of Mary Tyler Moore's life, which is really the part of this story that gets lost every time someone chases the crush angle for a catchy headline. The actual headline here isn't "co-stars had feelings for each other." It's "co-stars had feelings for each other, chose loyalty over temptation, and stayed close for the next 50 years anyway, long after the show had ended and long after either of them needed the other for their careers." That's genuinely rare in Hollywood. Plenty of famous on-screen pairs can barely tolerate each other once the cameras stop. Plenty more burn bright during production and then simply drift apart the moment everyone moves on to the next project. Van Dyke and Moore did the opposite. Whatever chemistry carried them through 5 seasons of live audience television clearly wasn't only a performance. It became the foundation of a real, lasting friendship between two people who respected each other deeply for the rest of Moore's life. When Mary Tyler Moore died in 2017, Van Dyke didn't respond like a man commenting on a former coworker he hadn't thought about in years. He spoke publicly, and he didn't hold back on what she meant to him, both personally and professionally. He called her one of the best comedic talents he'd ever worked with, and he praised her timing specifically. The way she could land a joke with nothing more than a look or a perfectly held pause. Anyone who has actually watched an episode of The Dick Van Dyke Show understands exactly why that particular skill gets brought up so often when people talk about her. Van Dyke, who spent 5 years standing next to her doing that exact kind of work, understood better than almost anyone alive just how rare that talent actually was. This wasn't a scripted tribute handed to him by a publicist. This was a man in his 90s, talking largely unprompted, about someone he had cared about for over 50 years. The crush from 1961 hadn't faded into some vague memory tucked away in an old scrapbook. It had matured into genuine grief for a friend he had known for the better part of his adult life. Now fast forward to December of 2025, when Van Dyke turned 100 years old. The milestone brought a wave of new interviews and tributes, along with a book he'd recently published on lessons from a century of living, and once again, in interview after interview, Mary Tyler Moore's name kept surfacing. You genuinely cannot tell the story of Van Dyke's career without her standing right there in nearly every retrospective written about him. In those 100th birthday interviews, he spoke with the same openness and humor he's always brought to public life. Joking about his age, crediting his wife Arlene Silver with keeping him active and grounded, and reflecting on a career that includes multiple Emmys, a Tony, and a Grammy, along with a daytime Emmy win in his 90s that briefly made him one of the oldest winners in that award's history. But ask anyone what actually defined that career, ask any entertainment journalist covering his 100th birthday, and The Dick Van Dyke Show comes up almost immediately. And so does she. That's really the important point buried underneath all the headlines that keep trying to reframe this as some dramatic new confession. There was never a moment where Dick Van Dyke finally broke his silence about Mary Tyler Moore, because he was never actually silent about her to begin with. He's talked about the crush. He's talked about the fits of laughter on set. He's talked about her talent and her friendship, consistently, in interviews stretching from right after her passing all the way up through his 100th birthday nearly a decade later. What's actually happening isn't a secret getting dramatically revealed after decades of silence. It's a man, now 100 years old, still choosing, freely and repeatedly, to honor someone who shaped one of the most important chapters of his career, every time he's given the chance to talk about her. There's something almost old-fashioned about the whole story, and it's worth sitting with, because it says something about the era these two came up in. This was the early 1960s. Television was still a relatively young medium, and the people making these shows were often working in a much smaller, tighter-knit industry than the sprawling entertainment world we know today. There was less separation between someone's personal life and their professional one, which meant there was also less room to hide anything, even if either of them had wanted to. Van Dyke and Moore weren't operating in some anonymous corner of a massive industry where nobody would notice if lines got crossed. They were the two biggest names on one of the most watched shows on American television, surrounded by crew, producers, and a live studio audience every single week. If something more had actually happened between them, the odds of it staying quiet for 60 years, through multiple rounds of interviews after Moore's death and now through Van Dyke's own 100th birthday coverage, would be close to impossible. Secrets that large simply don't survive that